Here now, Lieutenant General Richard Newton, NewsNation senior national security contributor and former U.S. Air Force Assistant Vice Chief of Staff. Good morning to you. We are hearing so much discussion about international laws of war. Can you take us through briefly the pillars of the Geneva Convention and what the laws of war are as it pertains to what we're seeing play out in the Middle East?
Well, broadly speaking, Marni, and good morning. Always good to be with you. The laws of war go back, as you mentioned, in the Geneva Convention, so that there are certain norms that are established on a legal basis, and that legal basis is whereby a number of signatories to that Geneva Convention stays in play. It's been that way for decades. In fact, as an Air Force pilot and Air Force officer, and our military men and women are schooled on what those Geneva Convention laws are, not only in terms of if we were captured and so forth, but also in the event that we, in our conflict, and what the norms are. You're seeing the breaking of those norms. You're seeing, civilians being used as what Hamas would consider legitimate targets. That is way out of bounds of the norms and certainly the Geneva Convention. That's where you also get the cries of war crimes that you and I've talked about on air, especially with Russia and Ukraine right now. And so those Geneva Convention rules are to keep the battlefield inside that kinetic space, if you will, but also to protect the lives of civilians. And it's based on not only law, but tradition. But now in 21st century warfare with Hamas, Iran, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and so forth, you can throw a lot of those norms just out the window in terms of how they go about diabolically try to destroy the lives of civilians and use them as what they consider legitimate targets on the battlefield.
Right. And is it difficult to hold one group accountable? I mean, Hamas in this instance for breaking the rules of war when, one, they clearly don't care, but also we're in the fog of war.
Indeed. And for example, in Gaza right now, the Israeli ground forces, and my sources tell me that they're beginning to encircle Gaza City, which is the most urban area in the world. My point being is there now it's going to get really, really difficult for the Israeli ground forces. That being said, they're going to have to go block by block and apartment building and structures by structures and literally room by room. There'll be booby traps in there, but the existence and how Hamas exists is below the ground. It's in a series of networks of tunnels that they've been able to expand ever since they've been in control since 2007. And then they get out of the ground, they come up and they really mix in with civilians and innocent Palestinians. And therefore that is in and of itself using it as a shield, but they'll put their headquarters, for instance, underneath hospitals and so forth, and then they'll bring the hostages up and up into the above the tunnels and below and so forth. My whole point of that is this whole nature of warfare is not simplistic. It's very complex, and then you throwing out the Geneva Convention rules out the door becomes very complex and very difficult for the Israeli ground forces to really. Their aim here is to destroy Hamas, but also rescue the hostages at the same time. Very chaotic, very complex, and I'm afraid in this urban warfare that as it will be ensuing here in the next several days and weeks will be a very bloody affair.
Right, and there is some talk about an exchange of hostages for Palestinian prisoners that are being held in Israel. What's your read on that likelihood and the risk of trusting Hamas in that situation?
Well, bottom line up front, I do not trust Hamas at all, and I know Israel doesn't either. If there is some effort through a third party, say Qatar or some other nation, for an exchange of hostages, I think Israel would take that because of the very strong sentiments that Prime Minister Netanyahu is feeling right now, especially with the hostage families and so forth. And if I had a member who was hostage, I'd be trying to do the same thing. But it's going to be very delicate, very surgical, and what Prime Minister Netanyahu has to be careful of is placating Hamas or showing that he's actually weakened and will be willing to negotiate, not only for this conflict, but for future conflicts. You don't negotiate with hostages, or I'm sorry, with terrorists. But nonetheless, if there is a breakthrough and you can save lives, I think he'll take it. But it's all based on what conditions and what settings, and therefore where he is in terms of the invasion and where he is in terms of being able to destroy Hamas. And if he's on the cusp of perhaps rescuing the hostages, that would be off the deal. But if it looks like there's a long-term opportunity here, I think he'll take it. But we'll have to see what the details say.
President Biden did send a direct message to the Iranian Supreme Leader, warning him not to target U.S. troops in the Middle East. What are your thoughts on the U.S.'s approach to Iran at this point?
Well, I think it's got to be very deliberate. It's got to show that as we try to deter Iran and dissuade them, demonstrated a couple days or so ago when the flight of two F-16s took out Iranian terrorist proxies in their attempts to attack our men and women in Iraq and Syria. We took out their weapons and their ammunition storage areas very effectively.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.